Good evening, everyone. It wasn't supposed to be like this, but it is. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of the Audubon Society, and welcome to this evening's program on urban forests and climate change. Connecticut wishes to honor the indigenous people native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawak, Rampiak, Totocket, Minocatauk, and Hammonasset tribes. As we advocate for conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of the native and indigenous people who cherished the land long before European colonization. We have two upcoming events in July and August. On July 13th at West River Memorial Park, the Barnard Nature Center over off of 34 and Route 10. We have the West River Water Festival. That's July 13th. And then on August 10th, Saturday, August 10th, we're doing a whale watch, for which there's a flyer on the table back there. You can sign up for those on the website. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Danica Doroski, who's been working with urban forestry and related fields for more than 10 years. Since she got her PhD at the Yale School of Environment, she's been the state urban forester at DEEP. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Does everyone have a chair or a comfortable place to sit-ish? I think those are for children, but maybe there's some small people. Certainly I don't need this chair here, so I'll put this out of the way. And it is hot in here, so if you need to go outside and get a breather, I won't be offended, either from my talk or just from the heat. That's totally fine. So hi everyone, I'm Danica. I also want to take the chance to introduce the rest of our urban forestry team at DEEP. We're so excited. We have some new members. It's been a one-man show for a long time. And just recently we had Chris Teeter join our team. Chris brings a lot of great arboriculture experience. He's joined as the partnership coordinator, so managing a lot of these types of presentations and just helping us do a better job of connecting the dots between the different stakeholders that are working in this space. And then we also just maybe 1 week ago, had Les Welker join our team, also an alum of the Yale School of the Environment. And Les is helping us to manage our subgrant programs, which, you know, if you've been listening in at all or familiar at all with Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, urban forestry has really been getting inundated with a lot of funding, which is very exciting. But we need people on the ground to help implement that great work. So this is our team. It's very exciting to have a team. So just a quick overview. This presentation should clock in at about 45 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions. I ask that you just hold your questions until the end of the presentation. The topic is urban forests and climate change. Before I launch into that, I just want to introduce what urban forests are, and I really want to introduce our program because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be working across the state in a more meaningful way. And then we're going to kind of dive in to talk about, you know, I think probably throughout this talk, you're familiar with climate change impacts generally. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the exacerbated impacts that cities are experiencing, some of the ways trees can help us mitigate these impacts, but then also some of the ways that, you know, trees themselves are really vulnerable to this changing climate. And so ways that we can kind of manage our urban forests thoughtfully. So I always have this slide in my presentations. I love this graphic. It's just a schematic of describing what is urban forestry. And I like this graphic because I think often urban forestry gets conflated with street trees and arboriculture. And certainly street trees are part of our urban and community forests, but urban forestry is so much more than that. When we're thinking about comprehensive urban forest management, we're thinking at a landscape scale. And so that includes street trees, but it also includes, you know, residential trees, trees in people's yards. It includes trees in landscaped parks. and often forgotten, but extremely important. It includes what I call forested natural areas. These are parks like East Rock Park right behind us, right? This is a city park, a New Haven city park that looks and functions very much like a forest in a rural area. We don't typically have foresters that are doing forest management in our urban areas. And so these spaces tend to get extremely neglected, even though when we're thinking about carbon storage, when we're thinking about climate change mitigation, this forest type is especially important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I think if you're here, you probably are aware of the fact that trees provide lots of important co-benefits. I always have some sort of nod to the variety of different benefits that they provide. Instead, I'm going to spend time on this slide, which actually quantifies some of the impacts of our urban trees in Connecticut. So I mentioned we have a lot of funding through sub-grant programs. We are developing data collection protocols so that all trees planted with our grant funds are documented in a meaningful way that allows us to estimate how much carbon is actually being stored by these trees that were planted, how much stormwater is being absorbed, how much pollution is being mitigated. And with urban forests, you know, it's always as much about the trees as it is about the community. And so in urban and community forestry, we're also trying to document, you know, trainings and workshops. So through our last grant program this past year, you know, 92 different trainings and workshops hosted, engaging the public in urban and community forestry, 77 green jobs supported. Many of you were in New Haven might be familiar with the Urban Resources Initiative that works very closely with an organization called Emerge that works with folks returning from incarceration to provide workforce experience. And that's not just happening in New Haven, that's a model that's being replicated across our state. And then, you know, almost 2,000 community members engaged. So this is, you know, urban and community forests are about bringing communities together, about bringing people, you know, up to speed and to have some sense of space within the urban environment. Our urban and community forestry program is an assistance program. So we're not like our colleagues in the state lands program where they're actively out there managing state-owned forests. We're working with all of you. We're working with municipalities, with nonprofits, with community groups to provide both technical and financial assistance. So financial assistance means sub-grants, and we have a lot of sub-grants available, which myself or Leth are happy to talk to you all about afterwards. And then we also provide a lot of technical assistance. So that could mean a simple email if you have a question about a tree or a tree issue. It could also mean a site visit. So Chris Teeter is you know, scheduling site visits around the state to go out and look at some of these urban and community forests and provide recommendations. And again, us as the stakeholders are kind of uniquely suited to help connect the dots and you know, let you know what else is happening in other cities that you could learn from or that you could be collaborating with. Two pillars of our program and of our agency really are climate change and environmental justice. So everything that DEEP is doing and everything that urban forestry is doing certainly is done through the lens of what does this mean for climate change and how does this help us rectify historic injustices in some communities that we know have inadequate canopy cover, inadequate access to a lot of the benefits I just mentioned. So now I'll just kind of dive into the topic du jour, which is talking more about actual climate change impacts. I'm sure a lot of these are not new or unfamiliar. You know, we know climate change is bringing, you know, things like elevated temperatures that comes often with longer growing seasons, more droughts and heat waves, changes in precipitation patterns. So in addition to having really, really dry seasons, we're also getting precipitation at a time that we're not expecting it or that our plants and our ecosystems aren't used to expecting it or adapted to expect that. And then also, you know, increasing the intensity and the frequency of storm events. Sea level rise, I mentioned because Connecticut, we're a coastal state and the sea level rise is impacting our coastal communities and beyond. So these are things everyone is thinking about, but in our cities, I think we're feeling a lot of these impacts, especially acutely. You may have heard of the urban heat island effect. This is a phenomenon that causes urban areas to be, in some cases, up to 19 degrees hotter than surrounding rural areas. We're probably experiencing part of it today. Part of urban heat island effect is that impervious surface absorbs the heat and then continues to radiate it out. So instead of getting some relief when the sun goes down, we're continuing to feel that heat into the evening. And so often we talk about urban heat island effect as a health issue. It's a health issue for people that don't have access to air conditioning or that find it cost prohibitive to run their air conditioning. But it also is really a concern for vulnerable populations when nighttime temperatures, when there's no relief. So when it's hot during the day and it continues to be really hot through the evening. And then we also, because of that high level of impervious surface, experience a lot of flooding. I see these photos from New York City all the time with the subway underwater, people wading through water. I think that's the reality now of the urban environment. And this flooding is, an issue from damage and human health, but it also causes a lot of water quality issues. So you may have heard of combined sewer systems. We have a lot of them in Connecticut. This means that, normally our drainage, our street drains are going to go to a water treatment plant and get treated before they're released. Anytime our stormwater exceeds the capacity of the wastewater treatment, sewage and wastewater are going directly into our water streams. And so to kind of, nod to that environmental justice piece, and I already alluded to this a little bit, that all of these impacts are being felt most intensely by our vulnerable populations. There was a study done by researchers at the Nature Conservancy a couple of years ago that looked at tree cover and income across the entire US. And that study actually called out Connecticut as having 5 of the 10 worst disparities in tree cover and income in the nation. So the fun fact we love to share about Connecticut is that we have the highest urban tree cover in the nation. So we have the most urban tree cover, but we also have some of the greatest inequities in that canopy cover. And this graphic is maybe a little bit hard to see, but you can see the correlation right in New Haven. So here we are in the East Rock neighborhood, which is a darker shade of green. This is canopy cover. Not surprisingly, we have East Rock Park right behind us, but that's correlated with the lighter shade of brown here. So in general, people living in East Rock have a lower percentage of people in poverty, and that's in direct contrast to what we observe, for example, in the Hill neighborhood along Long Wharf. And so, part of the purpose of our program is thinking about how urban trees can be used to help ameliorate some of these impacts. Urban trees are always sort of touted as this great climate solution because as trees grow, they store and sequester carbon. In reality, a street tree is not going to store and sequester that much carbon. A single tree can only store so much carbon in its lifetime. When you're talking about a street tree, which is growing under really harsh conditions, that carbon storage is going to be somewhat limited. So, we did our nice graphic, we planted this many trees, how much carbon did we store? If you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's not that impressive. Where you get really impressive carbon storage is places like East Rock Park, places where you have natural regeneration, where you have natural forest dynamics, where you have natural soils that are also storing a lot of that carbon. So that's another reason it's really important not to overlook spaces like East Rock Park. I live in Westville, so right near West Rock State Park. These are really where we're going to get the bulk of our carbon storage and sequestration. But we like trees and we like promoting trees because they offer all of these co-benefits, right? So what you're looking at now, this is the greater Bridgeport area. The graphic on the left is showing you surface temperature. So this is using satellite imagery to basically detect surface temperature within that area. Darker red means hotter temperatures. And then this graphic on the right is showing you tree canopy cover. So again, dark red translates to lower tree cover. This kind of data is really useful. We see a lot of this because this kind of data is really easy to procure at a large scale. What we see less of is data that's actually documenting the air temperature and correlating that to tree cover. So air temperature is what we're feeling. We're not laying on the pavement with our cheeks to the parking lot, right? We're walking around, and you know from walking around that you can experience different temperatures just from the way air flows. So I wanted to highlight some very cool research that is being done. Actually, some of it has been done in New Haven, where researchers have gone around, they've mounted these temperature loggers onto bicycles, and they're biking around the city. We did the same thing in New Haven. And then they're taking those data back to their statistical programs to correlate that with tree canopy cover to try and understand how does this change our actual air temperature. Some cool stats to share from some of those studies are, the actual impact of that. I, as the urban forester, always get the question of like, well, if we plant, how many trees do we have to plant to get this temperature reduction? And the answer is it's really complicated, right? A lot of it has to do with the spatial scale you're thinking about. A single tree is very different than when you're thinking of a block scale, when you're thinking about a neighborhood scale. So the studies I highlighted here are interesting in that they kind of look at that super granular level. So this first study, it was done in Worcester, Mass. Worcester, Mass, you may be familiar with, had an Asian longhorn beetle infestation and had at that point, I think like 90% of their canopy was maple. And so Asian longhorn beetle targets maples, and they lost a huge amount of their canopy in a very short amount of time. Very unfortunate for the city of Worcester, very fortunate for the purposes of research that is able to then retroactively see when we lose canopy, then what happens? So there's a bunch of cool studies that I'm happy to share after this talk that find, for example, like upticks in crime when that canopy cover was lost. But this study I want to highlight here was able to look at and say, okay, a single tree removal, what's the impact of that single tree removal? And they found it can result in a 4 degrees Celsius increase. I don't know what the equation is to Fahrenheit, but it would be a little bit bigger in Fahrenheit. And then 3 days longer of summer temperatures. So that's pretty significant. And that's important to keep in mind because one of the things we are always trying to promote in our program is preservation and care of existing trees, not just focus on planting new trees. Those large mature trees, that's a huge loss. And planting new trees, it's going to take a really long time to kind of catch up to that cooling benefit. The other thing that's very interesting to me about some of these studies is what they found. This researcher is Dr. Zitter. She did work, I think, out of Canada, but the study in New Haven as well. The greatest temperature reduction only occurs when canopy cover reaches a threshold, and that threshold is about 40%. So that's also really useful for our planning. A lot of cities set what they call urban tree canopy goals. So they say we want to increase canopy cover by 10%, by 5%. We have our own urban tree canopy cover goal for the state, if you didn't know. In July of 2023, we passed Public Act 23203. Actually, I don't remember. I think some combination of those numbers, but I'll look it up for you. But that public act set a goal to increase canopy cover by 5% in our environmental justice communities. So to me, having information like this to know that if we really want to cool our cities, we have to reach this 40% threshold is really meaningful. It also tells me that we need to be a lot more comprehensive in our approach. New Haven, for reference, has about 38% citywide tree canopy cover, and that's thinking about private land, public land, parks, street trees, everything, okay? So when we're talking about trying to plant trees or trying to maintain trees for for cooling purposes, we need to be engaging a lot of different stakeholders because we're not going to get to 40% in any city really just focusing on one type of tree or one type of stakeholder. The other, really impactful thing that trees can do when we're thinking about climate change is helping mitigate stormwater runoff. Trees are not the best tool for mitigating flooding, and they're not going to manage, they're not the sort of silver bullet for urban flooding, but they provide a lot of other benefits, and they can help to manage some of these stormwater issues that I referenced earlier. One of the big ways they do that is just by slowing down rainfall. They're absorbing rainfall in their leaves and in their branches, and so that slows the percolation into the soil, reducing the amount that's going to get runoff right off the bat. The other way they do that is trees have to grow in soil. Soil is much more effective at taking up water than pavement, but compacted soil is not so great. So if you think about a ball of soil in your hand that you've kind of like mished and pushed together, pouring water over it, it's mostly going to bead out. And that's what a lot of our urban soils look like. We're in a very compacted environment. We have a lot of development. Tree roots, as they grow, are breaking up the soil. They're increasing the permeability of the soil, and they're also adding organic matter to the soil, so increasing the potential to absorb future water. So they're helping slow rainfall, but they're also helping to increase storage in the soil. And so again, some stats, from some recent studies that attempt to quantify the stormwater mitigation potential of urban trees. So that I mentioned that interfall and absorbing, through leaves and branches, 20 to 60% of precipitation that's falling, and then increasing water storage in soil by 150 to 800%. If you're a stats person, you're probably noticing that's a huge amount of variation. And that's another really important part about this whole conversation, is that not all trees are created equally. And so when you're thinking about, planting a tree to help absorb stormwater, and you're planting all small statured, short-lived tree lilacs, for example, that's not ever going to absorb as much water, falling down as much water in the soil as a large statured, long-lived tree like an oak, for example. So a lot of this variation that these researchers found was in large part just by species, different tree species. So we want to think about, if we're really using urban trees as a tool for climate change, we need to also be really thoughtful about what types of trees we're planting. So, that sort of, I think, sets the stage for why urban trees are really being promoted currently as this great nature-based solution. Nature-based solutions, if you're not familiar, is just this idea of kind of harnessing and leveraging natural systems like a wetland or like a living shoreline to help increase our resilience to climate change. And certainly urban trees are, part of that solution. But what I want to transition to is now a conversation about, trees are only going to provide those benefits as long as they're alive. And if we want them to be alive, we need to make sure that the trees that we're planting today are going to be able to grow and to survive in both current and future conditions. And we know these conditions are changing, right? All of these things I just talked about, elevated temperatures, droughts and heat waves, intense and frequent storm events, these are all going to impact the way trees are able to grow and survive in our communities. So the second part of this talk, I'm going to kind of zero in on some of the ways trees are vulnerable to climate change impacts, and then provide some suggestions and recommendations, some things that I think we should be really thinking about to make sure we're managing for a resilient forest. As we're seeing our climate change, there's all kinds of scientists creating really awesome models to help us understand how different species will respond. These visuals I'm showing you here are from the US Forest Service. I provided the link. I'll provide the link after this talk. But this is a super cool tool that lets you go through different species and look at, okay, where is their current range? So this is chestnut oak. Chestnut oak, here we are in Connecticut. Chestnut oak is, you can see there's some light green indicating it's somewhat important, but for the most part, this is a species we're seeing mostly in the southern part of the country. This is showing you chestnut oak's predicted range in a high emission scenario. And so here we are in Connecticut, and you can see a lot of this yellow has changed to green. So that's a species that's expected to do really well. Anecdotally, chestnut oak is a great urban species. There's a lot of it in East Rock Park. You see it growing on all the dry, high sites that are probably not great for a lot of other species. And I think that's probably one of the reasons it's expected to do well, is it's pretty drought tolerant. And then we see sort of the converse for some of our other native species. So here's the species importance currently for sugar maple. A lot of dark green and even blue. It's really important species in the Northeast. And this is predicted with climate change. So we see a lot affect dark green, transition to the lighter green and yellow. We, in our program, are not recommending planting sugar maples at this point because of data like these that indicate that it's not going to fare very well in future climate change scenarios. And so I think one thing that we can be doing as land managers, as residents, as citizens, is thinking about these different adaptability potentials in species when we're selecting what species to plant. The Urban Resources Initiative is planting Kentucky coffee tree as a street tree, which is a species that is native somewhat south of us, but isn't necessarily part of what has been historically, our native range, but seems to be doing well. And we have some really cool projects right here in Connecticut that are experimenting with southern genotypes of species we have here. So taking, for example, this particular species, this is here in New Haven, by the way, if you want to visit. This is a large collaboration between researchers and practitioners that includes multiple cities along the Eastern Seaboard: Baltimore, New York City, Philadelphia, New Haven, Springfield, Massachusetts. And they've installed experimental research plots in all of these cities. And each city has collected chestnut oak and white oak acorns, sent them down to a nursery in Kentucky where they've been grown on, brought them back up here. And you see this image here. This is at the Yale Natural Preserve. This is in Westville, if you're familiar with the golf course. You see these different colored flags. Those are all showing you different zones that these chestnut or white oaks came from. So if you go to Edgewood Park, if you go to either Summit East Rock Park, if you go to the Yale Natural Preserve, I don't think they'll let you in right now, but you can see a Kentucky chestnut oak growing next to a chestnut oak from Springfield, Massachusetts. And this is all part of this effort to try and understand how can we be planning for this changing climate. The other thing that I really, want to stress is that climate change is also unpredictable. So we have a lot of very smart people that are putting together some very cool models for how they think species will respond and how they think the climate will change. But the best way to really ensure resilience is to be planting diverse species from the get-go. We don't know what direction things will go in. We don't know if some species will turn out to be more resilient than we're expecting or less so. And so the last thing we want to do is, duplicate, Elm City, New Haven, and like this beautiful ash-lined street pre and post Emerald Ash Borer. And this is an area that I think we have a lot of work to do in. This is actually my own research from my graduate work at the Yale School of the Environment, where I surveyed cities all over the Northeast. I think we had 72 different cities. And we basically asked them, in the last 5 years, what species have you been planting and how many have you planted at each? And the idea was kind of to say, like, okay, so each city is thinking about diversity maybe in their own city. Urban Resources Initiative, for example, follows something called the 10-20-30 rule that says they're going to plant no more than 10% of one species, 20% of one genus, and 30% of one family. Did I say that right? But New Haven isn't necessarily talking to Hartford or talking to Meriden or talking to any of these other cities to say, hey, are you guys also planting all of this same sort of palette? And so it turns out when we scale up and we start looking at what's happening at the regional level, we can see we're pretty reliant on a few families and genera. So I'm sure you can't see from here, this is Latin names all along the x-axis. I did provide these little icons to help you see. So right here, this is the cherry family. So we love planting our cherries, right? This is the legume family. So this is mostly honey locust, very popular street tree. We've got all of our oaks here, and then we've got our maples. And so half of all the trees that we're planting in the Northeast are in these same 4 families. And this whole conversation, I think, gets much more worrisome when we think about what species we're relying on for large statured shade trees versus smaller statured ornamentals that are going under utility lines. So I mentioned again, not all trees are created equal. Not that ornamental trees have a great time and place, but often when we're planting a shade tree, the go-to is the oak. Everyone loves oaks, and I do too. But 23% of all the trees in the Northeast that we're planting are oak, are in the oak genus. So we've got spongy moth, we've got oak wilt, we've got a lot of things that are coming for our oaks. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't plant oak, but it does mean that we should be looking to other potential shade species to diversify our shade tree palette. I always use this talk as an opportunity to promote my love of hickories. Hickories are fantastic native trees. They grow really, really well in urban environments. I've heard pushback because they have nuts. Yeah, I know. So do oaks. And that they have a taproot that can make them challenging to transplant, so they can be hard to procure from local nurseries. But if you look on this bar here, hickory is nowhere to be found. So I think we do need to be thinking about, how can we introduce a little bit more diversity, not have everyone relying on oaks as their primary shade tree species. And the story is even more true when we look at our ornamental trees. So these are smaller stature trees. These are kind of trees you see planted under power lines most often. And 40% are either cherries or tree lilacs. People love tree lilacs. And they are like, can be really beautiful trees, but I think we can look at a graphic like this and maybe suggest that we're planting too many. The other thing that I want you to take away from this graphic is most of the ornamental trees that we're planting are non-native species. When we're thinking about urban environments, we can't only plant native species because we have certain diversity thresholds that we're trying to meet. But a lot of these tree lilac, for example, I think SIPWIG, the Connecticut invasive plant, whatever that stands for, has identified tree lilac as a potentially invasive species. Some of our colleagues in Minnesota and the Midwest have already found that it is invasive. And a lot of these cherries, there was a study out of the New York Botanical Garden a couple years ago that found that a lot of these cherries are becoming invasive as well. So one of the ways trees become invasive, one of many, is by overplanting and just dominating the seed source. That's part of what you see here in New Haven with Norway maples. So I think we need to be super thoughtful about, if we're relying a lot on these non-native species, how many of them we're planting. And I think from our program standpoint, I look at a graphic like this and it conveys to me that we really need to be working with our nurserymen more closely, because municipalities and volunteer groups or residents are only going to plant what's commercially available. And so there's kind of this chicken and egg scenario where nurserymen don't want to grow what they don't know there isn't an appetite for. And so one of the things we talk about and we think about in our program is how can we kind of promote and help liaise between these stakeholders to make sure that there's a diversity of plants available. Prolonged periods of drought is absolutely something we're experiencing with climate change, and this causes massive stress to trees. We've had a lot of our municipalities report widespread tree mortality from droughts the last couple of years. And so when we're planting trees, I think we always in our sub-grant programs are requiring that our contractors or our sub-grantees have a plan in place for best management practices for watering. So for watering, that means, I texted Les this earlier because I didn't want to mess it up, 25 gallons a week for the first 3 years of life, okay? Gator bags are used very frequently, but can be really damaging to trees if they're not removed, as the tree grows. The other thing is, setting our trees up for success by giving them adequate space to grow. Some cities like New York City have ordinances that mandate a certain size tree pit for any new tree that's planted. And so when we're thinking about trees' response to drought, if we're not giving them an adequate pool of soil to pull from, we're really not setting them up for long-term health. Another big climate change impact is this increase in intensity in storms. And these storms are a huge issue for our mature canopy. They're damaging to the canopy, and they're also damaging to public perceptions of trees. People are really afraid of trees when they see the kind of damage that they can do. And people don't like losing electricity and having property damage. And so once trees get to be a certain size, it's very expensive and very intensive to manage those trees and to try and make them more storm resilient. but there are things that we can be doing throughout trees' life cycle, like proactive pruning practices that can help them to be much stronger in the long term. This is an image here. Chris gave a great talk yesterday in Southington and was kind of talking about co-dominant leaders. The fact that you often will have nursery stock, 2 leaders are competing for each other. When this tree is young, it's a little snip with clippers to establish that dominant trunk. That makes a huge difference down the road in the strength of that tree. So we don't have any in Connecticut that I'm aware of, but other cities like Philadelphia have citizen pruner programs. So these are citizens that get trained to go out. They're not sent out with chainsaws or lifts or anything dangerous, but they're sent out with clippers and are learning to look for things like this so that they can help increase that capacity of, municipalities, which we know can be so limited. And then the last, big recommendation to that end is to invest in something like a tree inventory. Land managers often, you may or may not be familiar with your local tree wardens. Just so you know, every municipality in Connecticut is required to have a tree warden that has care and control of trees on public lands. Tree wardens may wear many hats. It may be a director of public works that is doing highway work and doing a million other things. And so they are responding to hazard trees on a case-by-case basis as they get a call. They are not going out and, using a map like this that's helping them to identify, okay, which trees are high need for maintenance down the road. And having a tool like this can do wonders in terms of increasing the resilience of our mature trees in storms, because we're not responding after the fact, we're responding ahead of time. And this is my last slide, but this is, I think, a really important point, and that is, if we really want to talk about trees and urban trees and climate change, and climate change solutions, then we need to be thinking about the full life cycle of trees. Urban trees, if you didn't know, for the most part, when they die, they're cut down, they're sent to the landfill where they decompose and release all that CO2 back out into the atmosphere. Urban wood utilization programs, this is a photo from Keeney Park in Hartford, which has a really awesome urban wood utilization program, are taking trees that are coming down around the city and they are milling that into durable wood products that will keep that carbon stored up for the long term. Here in New Haven, there's there's something called City Bench, which is not a nonprofit entity, but is doing a lot of that similar work. And so if we're thinking about these as a long-term solution, we need to be thinking about the whole life cycle. So last thoughts, I think, I just want to leave you all with is that I think climate change is inevitable. Urbanization is inevitable, especially in a state like Connecticut. We are such an urbanized state. I mean, I think that's why we have the highest urban tree cover in the nation, is we just have so much urban cover. And urban trees and forests are a really great tool that we can be thinking about to combat a lot of the negative impacts of both urbanization and climate change. But it's not as simple as throwing money at the problem. It's not as simple as throwing trees in the ground. We have to be really thoughtful and intentional about the way we're doing our urban forest management. And that is it. And I just also wanted that last slide because this is my neighborhood park. This is Edgewood Park. This is a bald eagle that I saw one day running, and just so cool to me, and has always driven home why urban parks and urban forests are so important, because to see that when you live in an apartment is such a treat and such an important way to connect to nature. So anyway, that's my bragging photo, and I'll take questions. Yes.
You pay much attention to people's backyards, but is there any intent to study that? And right out here, there's a lot of land in the backyard.
Yes. So yeah, I have a few answers to that. There's something called urban forest analysis assessment, FIA. This is a Forest Service initiative to measure FIA is something we measure for our rural forest. So they basically randomly disperse points all over the forest, and they send researchers out to go and measure those trees and look and see, you know, what is the species composition, what is the size. Urban FIA is a national project, and we have one city, Bridgeport, that was selected as one of the sites for that study. And so Urban FIA, again, is putting down random points all over the city. So some of them are in backyards, some of them are in parks, but in most Connecticut communities, a lot of them are going to be in residential properties. That data has not been published yet. It will probably be available sometime early next year, so early 2025. That's one approach. I'm sure there are researchers that are doing these studies of residential lands, not nearly as many as the studies you see of street trees and of natural areas, because it's really hard to get landowner permission. And so that's a massive, I was at a conference a couple months ago, and there were researchers talking about developing a study to try and document what's happening in backyards. And the biggest cost associated with their study was just obtaining consent from people multiple times to go visit. So those are sort of two quick answers. And then in terms of what our program is doing, we, for the first time ever, were able to work with the U.S. Forest Service to allow some of our grant funds to support tree planting on private property. That's a big win. It's been really hard to secure that in the past, but it's really important because a lot of our cities don't have adequate space. A lot of these trees, like you go to Waterbury and there's just like no tree pits at all. There's nowhere to plant trees at all. So the opportunity is on private lands. So we have been able to get grant funds to support some of that work. We don't provide a lot of support to private landowners themselves, in part because we have to be careful within our agency about not being sort of like a free arboriculture service, which is not the purpose of our program. So that's, I think, a little flavor of some of the work we've done on private land, but I think in general, there's a real dearth of research on that particular land cover type because of the consent issue. Oh, yeah.
Question. And I don't have any data, it's just observation. In our work, I've noticed in certain areas that where oak is dominant, and there's a little bit of tree here, there's some beech and other underscores, we've been able to, but the oak is dominant, and I'm noticing that the ground is very compact and attracts the ground bees. Does that have to do with the high tech content, or and have you noticed anything in your data with like very compact soil in areas where oak is dominant?
I haven't. That's interesting. It would sort of go counter to what I would think, because the oaks, you know, are larger stature trees. So I would think that they would help do some work to decompact it. I don't know if you have any thoughts from your work in oak and soil compaction, but
my initial thought when you said that was just, I mean, it being in an urban area, there's kind of a foot traffic, so that might be why you've seen that correlation.
And the whole park has foot traffic, so it's just in those little zones.
it's because people love oaks. So there's more foot traffic over by the oaks. I don't know. That's interesting. If I find something, I'll let you know. Yeah. Yes.
The website or some kind of source where individuals like yourselves can go if you have a specific question and you need some kind of advice or about a certain situation, work, and where best to go.
Yeah, so you can, all of our photos and contact information is on our website. So I don't have a link here, but I can share with Dennis, and maybe he can share out. Oh, and I have a card, so I can give you that too. And we are housed within Division of Forestry, and we also work very closely with our colleagues in the service forestry program. The service forestry program is a little bit distinct in that service forestry is focused on landowners with large parcels, so 10 acres or more. But if you have a question about forestry in general, we have a deep, it's like deep.forestry@ct.gov that just channels all of those to the different appropriate programs. So I'll give you my card before you leave, and then you can have my contact, and I can figure out the whatever the deep.forestry email, and I can send you a link to the website. Yes.
state determines eligibility for environmental justice communities because I live in Camden, the southern part of town borders right on the Haven, which is eligible for grants. And I looked on the state website and it said those neighborhoods were not eligible. And it's basically the same neighborhood.
I know, it's so ridiculous. It has to do with funding source. So we get our funding, most of our funding comes from the federal government. And so, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act funding that we just received and the most recent subgrant program that we just ran was federal funding, and we were required by our partners at the U.S. Forest Service to use a federal tool. And that tool is the Climate and Justice Economic Screening Tool. It is not, it overlaps in some areas, but does not overlap with our state environmental justice tool. The state defines environmental justice by poverty thresholds. And so there's some overlap, but it's not comprehensive. It's a problem. We have had conversations with the Forest Service about in our next round of grants being able to take a broader approach. But because of the funding source, you know, we ultimately have to be beholden to where our funding is coming from. But the way the state defines environmental justice is most often by our state statute. I think it's like 2220A or something, blah, blah, whatever. Also distressed municipalities sometimes fall within that as well. So environmental justice communities at the census tract level, distressed municipalities by the municipality. And then we also have to use this national tool within our program, the Climate and Justice Economic Screening Tool. The state also did develop a much more comprehensive environmental justice tool that you can find through the CIRCA website. And that is the most comprehensive of them all, but it's not a binary yes, no, which honestly probably makes more sense, right? We know that there's like, so it's not like, yes, you are environmental justice, no, you're not. It's a threshold of things. And so that tool that was developed by researchers at CIRCA, climate, someone knows what CIRCA stands for. I'll look it up and figure out for you. It's something, everything's a combination of climate, something. That tool, they brought in massive data sets, health data, brownfield, it's way more comprehensive. So there's a lot of different tools, but ultimately it often boils down to the funding source.
Are there state funds that this?
Our program only was able to secure state funding once. Since I've been in this role, we're going to try and leverage our most recent grant round. We had $1 million available to subaward, and we got requests for nearly 4 million. So we're going to try and ride that and really leverage the state to put some money into the program, because yes, when we have state dollars, we have way more flexibility about how it can be spent and where it can be spent. Yes.
Can you recognize some trees and
So I like, not everyone likes them because I like hawthorns. They're native. They do have thorns, so I've heard that they're maybe not as popular. But those, we do have a close relationship. You may or may not have heard of Planter's Choice, which is, I think, maybe only commercial. I'm not sure if you can go as a homeowner. Yeah, but they have them, and probably Urbanscapes has some suggestions and ideas too. But the small tree, it is a challenge to find that diversity, especially if you want native species. Recommendations for small stature trees under power lines that aren't tree lilac and cherry. There's a lot of serviceberry being planted. I think that's like the only native one. This right here, Amelanchier, this is serviceberry. So people do like serviceberry a lot, and it is native. One of the few natives on here. What's that? Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts or recommendations. Yeah.
I see American one. It's a water trees, but I have to see, I said corn beans and bell peppers.
some other good ones on there, like, you know, Cercis, red buds and dogwoods.
Yep.
Probably not all of them, but
What do you think of crabapple?
I don't have strong feelings. Yeah. You guys?
there's one native crab apple that I've never found in the nursery trade. But, all the crab apples that are available are not native varieties, but.
Yeah.
They're resilient and, you know, let me get a bit of a mess underneath, but.
Yes.
Is it possible to grind stone and things free in that spot? And if possible, if there's funding available for that. So many different islands, there's so many trees that they just cut down.
Yeah,
And it's a stump, and now we can't plant a tree there.
I know. Where do you live or where are you describing?
Like on, I live on Indy, Alden, like all. like-
Oh, New Haven area. Yeah. Yeah, it's a problem. Well, the quick answer is we haven't provided grant funding to plant on tree stumps, but we have provided grant funding to remove tree stumps, which I know, we've gotten pushback from review committees because it's like people want to see trees planted, but obviously the first step is making sure that there's a space to plant it. Deep had proposed legislation, I think last year that didn't end up getting passed, that would have required the utility companies in certain neighborhoods to actually remove stumps. So that would fall on the municipality themselves. Removing stumps can be really expensive and time intensive, so it's often just not a priority. I have no experience planting in a tree stump.
That wood goes, can go fairly, you know, several.
Yeah.
Several maybe foot or so deep, you know, so you really have to get down to clear enough space.
I think my other concern too would be thinking about like wind firmness and resilience against storms is maybe if you're growing something on an existing stump, you're not setting it up to have a strong foundation later in its life, but
Yeah, don't plant any trees on the stump.
Yeah.
Or even in
Now there's not trees on the street.
yeah.
if they had a big pond of decay already in the center, and you have some seedlings you're transplanting.
You could try.
It might work.
Right.
Might-
I know someone who did it, some says they waited until a few years,
Yeah.
brought it out in the London auger.
Yeah.
Ground it into such, they could themselves, and then they. It's okay, but it's an understory tree, it's like, not a big tree. it's like-
Yeah. I mean, in the woods, you see it all the time. You have like what are called nurse trees where like logs fall and they're left there and it's like a super nutrient rich, like mineral soil for seedlings to grow in. So it's cool to think about borrowing ideas from our rural forests and urban setting, but Alden, McKinley, yeah.
Reach out to every resources initiative in Western Street, they help ask about the city.
Oh, that's the most useful advice. Yes.
Have there been any studies made on the trade-off between a tree that shades the roof and or putting a solar panel on that roof?
Maybe, if there are, I'm not familiar. Yeah,
Because that's part of the environment. But you're, with solar panels, it's defending CO2. Going into the,
right.
and the other is soaking it up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, I think obviously I love trees and solar panels are not providing all of those additional co-benefits that trees are. But in terms, like from a carbon perspective, I don't have the research or the data to say one way or the other. Oh,
For the grants, was there any restriction on the trees you can plant? Do they have to be natives?
they don't have to be natives, but they can be invasive. And in this current, in our upcoming grant rounds, based off of lessons learned from previous grant rounds, we have put an item in all of our contracts now that say, we want that you have to make your best efforts to plant a large statured tree if the space and overhanging utilities allow. The reason we're doing that is because in our last round, we looked at our data and we saw that most of the trees that were planted with our funding were a ton of red buds, which, you know, red buds are fine, but mostly it was small statured trees. And Some of that is because of the space, but I think some of it also is because of, sort of like experience gaps. I know anecdotally from a lot of the grantees that we worked with is they didn't know what trees to plant and they found Eversource's 30 under 30 list. And so I don't know if you're familiar with that. Eversource has a 30 under 30 poster. It's really pretty. It's really easy to see and understand. And if you are not super experienced in urban forestry, you don't know a lot about trees, it's very easy to find a list like that and use that as a planting recommendation list, when really that's for a very specific scenario. So no, we don't require it, but we do, we've had grantees request to plant Norway maples, for example, in the past, which if you're not familiar, it's an invasive tree. So we do require that grantees run their species list by us before planting because we want to avoid that. But in general, we're not being overly prescriptive with it. It's just to avoid planting invasives and also to try and make sure that we're planting larger stature trees wherever possible. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about your funding cycle for these sub-grants? Like when do they open up? How do we access them?
Yes, so the cycle is very sporadic. We are very much reacting to funding as it comes in and also reacting to our own capacity. So up until a couple months ago, it was just me. And so the grant programs were coming out as I had availability. Les has just been hired for a 4-year position with our program. And my hope is that with Les on board, we can have a little bit more scheduled. Some of our funding is always going to be sporadic because things like bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, those are kind of like one-time infusions. And that's just sort of, we deal with the hand we're dealt. But we do have more stable funding sources that can be offered on a more regular basis now that we have the capacity. We have a grants website that is always up to date. And if you added your emails to our list, we will add you to an email list to get notified when new grant opportunities come up. Yeah. Yes.
That's two questions. First was, what tool do you recommend for an inventory assessment?
For an inventory? The question is, what tool do I recommend for a neighborhood tree assessment? I recommend, like, it depends so much on the capacity and the budget of the group. So there are proprietary softwares, for example, Planet Geo is one, big national kind of urban forestry consulting firm. Davey Tree, you probably have heard of, is another big one. They do, inventories all over the country. You also don't need to hire a big national company. You can hire, we have small local groups. I think there's one called Trefoil that's doing some of the tree inventory work at the golf course, at the Yale golf course right now. And you can also kind of take advantage of the resource that's near you. So New Haven, uses students from Urban Resources Initiative. And I know that those students have actually been hired on grants to do inventory work in other municipalities. So that's also like an option. So I think a lot of it has to do with funding and also, what you're trying to keep track of. If you're trying to use it as like a workflow management, like your tree warden wants to see like who's worked on this tree, who hasn't worked on this tree, you need something more intense than if you just want to see what's the general composition of our trees, what's the general condition of our trees. And that quite honestly can be managed with an Excel spreadsheet, and you can you can use latitude and longitude on your phone. It's not super accurate, but it again depends on the resources that you have available. And we would be really happy in our program if it's something you want to pursue for your neighborhood to provide more technical assistance specific to your community.
That was my second question. We consult, with things like this, and also creating ribbon first.
Yeah, so we're still a relatively small staff, so we unfortunately can't do the inventory, we can't do the management plan, but we can help point you in the right direction of like, based off of your needs, here's what we think you might need, here's what we think you might want. And can also, refer you to other like sort of national tools. There's a lot of tools out there that are available. It can be very overwhelming. So I think what we can do is help point you in the right direction once we have a better idea of your needs.
What was the website you said about the showing where you started out with the person?
Oh, yeah, that's through the Forest Service. That the URL is here, which you're not going to be able to write down, but if you give me your contact information, I'm happy to send it to you after this presentation. Okay, well, yes. Invasive species, what? Removal, removal. Yeah, yep, yeah, we have a program that will be, well, first of all, most of our grants are general urban forestry grants, which means that you can fund anything broadly related to urban forestry. So it doesn't have to be tree planting. It can be invasive removal. In fact, in this last grant round, we funded several projects that were focused specifically on invasive species removal. And we will have some grants opening up, I don't know when, but sometime in the future, that are specifically focused on invasive species removal. So yeah, absolutely. It's all part of the whole canopy. So yes, we do fund that.
With that being said, if you remove something and replace it. What's the follow-up for that?
Yeah, well, I think so. In our grant applications, we have a variety of different scoring criteria, but one of the big criteria that the review committee is always looking for is like long-term sustainability and longevity. And so I won't give the specific example, but we did have an applicant request to do invasive removal in the last grant round. They weren't awarded funding in part because the review committee felt that it was removals without any plan for kind of long-term maintenance and replacement. A one-time removal is not going to do anything against invasive species. It's a long strategy. So that's something that the review committee is looking for. Yeah.
It was like we have like a 5 year.
Yeah.
We always pull you on this out and plant something. Right?
Oh,
You
good.
gotta think about erosion, you gotta think about.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah.
Not waiting, it's like
Yes.
years of.
Totally.
Perseverance. you
Yes.
know?
Okay, well, I'm hot, so I think we can call it. Thank you so much. It's
Thank you very much. If you signed up, if you registered through Mobilize, you'll get an email in the next couple of days with links to various things that Dan was talking about. And thank you for coming.
Oh, sorry, the list is that orange board. I'm just giving her my card. Yes, yeah, there you go.